We are going to dive straight into question 5 of paper 1, and my advice here comes from the examiner's report. So what they've noticed in 2018 is they prefer concise responses. This means really short responses that don't have any waffle in. Now, partly that could be because they don't want to have to mark too much, but to be fair, it's also much more difficult to write well in a short response. You really have to think, and that seems to improve the quality of your writing. If you're just doing it out of laziness, then it's not so good, but if you've actually crafted it to be short, then that's a really good clue that that's what you should be doing in your revision. Practicing writing 1.5 pages, say, 2 pages at most on question 5. Sometimes the examiners found that the more students wrote, the worse their ideas were and their structure lacked coherence. They would start adding bits in as they thought of them, but actually it wasn't the right place to put them, and students became much more inaccurate. So if that describes you, then you need to go for a shorter response. If that doesn't describe you, then you can afford length. So for example, if I were sitting this exam, I would be writing a longer piece. Especially if I were writing a story, because I would need a certain number of words to get my story in. However, if I weren't confident, then I wouldn't choose a story option. I'd go for a description and I'd keep it short. The other thing that they keep emphasizing is they much rather have quality rather than quantity. So that again is keeping it short. And then a really interesting feature that as an English teacher I really love, but it might surprise you. So what the examiners have noticed is crafting of the writing. And the way they've noticed that is they can see students looking back over their work and changing bits, adding bits in. Now, many students I teach like to be neat. And they have this idea that if they cross something out, even if it's neat, and then put an addition in, the examiner won't like it. And they've also got this idea that they need to be right first time, like this is a quiz show. But no, examiners are English teachers, and what we love is students thinking about the meaning of the words they're using and then the effect that those words are having. And if you cross some words out, or a phrase out, or a sentence out, and replace it with something that works much better, that's really exciting. It shows that you're thinking like a real writer, because crafting is what real writers do, and many English teachers write themselves. And it's what they do, and it's what they want to see their students doing. Now, I'm not suggesting that you randomly start crossing stuff out in the exam and changing it just to show that you're crafting. But what I am suggesting is if you take a few minutes to go back over your work and make it as effective as possible, that will get you extra marks. Okay, there are 3 structural features that the examiners have started to notice. And these are structural features which the examiners want. So I'm going to take you through them one at a time with an example of each to show you how it works to get you higher marks. So it's very likely that number 1, flashback, is something your teachers have taught you. A circular structure you possibly started to see in your practice of question 3 on this paper, because if you've seen my video you will realise that the examiners are selecting pieces that have a circular structure for you to write about. And now the examiners are saying, well, I think the students are paying attention to what they're doing in question 3, and they're using that in their answer to question 5. So I'm going to teach you the really easy technique of having a circular structure, and then a rather advanced technique, the extended metaphor. So let's dive in and see what these examples are like. So here's a flashback. She sat in the car waiting for her daughter to return. She couldn't move. Her wheelchair was still stashed in the boot. A sudden siren transported her back 20 years to the hospital ward. Its antiseptic corridors swimming before her confused her senses, and the one true prayer she kept repeating as each fluorescent flashed by. Please God, oh God, don't let my baby die. So hopefully you can see the job of the flashback here is to give you more insight into the character, their personality, and also into the events that happened for that character. This is called exposition. It means the backstory. So the exposition, it's really important, and it works whether this is a description or a story. This flashback still works. It's a really sophisticated way of writing because it depends on a stimulus. So here she's in the car, but what was the stimulus that took her back? It was a sudden sound. And it's easy to use the senses creatively in this way. So there'll be either a smell or a sound or something that you see, but smells or sounds are better, which suddenly transport a character backwards. Now, it gives you a much clearer understanding of the character. We know she was probably involved in an accident, and that's why the siren has reminded her of the hospital, so she was in an ambulance. We know that accident has somehow included her baby, so either she was pregnant or the baby was perhaps with her in a car. We don't know which yet, but those questions that we ask as a reader are the best way to get the reader gripped by the narrative or gripped by the description. So a flashback is a super useful tool. And I'm not just recommending it because it impresses examiners. I'm saying it impresses examiners because it's good writing. Okay, let's now look at the circular structure. So I've taken the same piece, but what I want to show you is two aspects of the circular structure here. So imagine this was the beginning of my writing. I can have the next two lines straight away, or I could have these next two lines as my ending of the piece. Let me show you what I mean. Had her legs been a small price to pay, she sat and waited for her daughter to return. So this line, she sat and waited for her daughter to return, take us back to the very first paragraph. And that's the very simplest way of having a circular structure. You go back to the first paragraph and you pick an idea that was in that and you repeat it in a slightly different way. So here, if this were the ending of my piece, let's imagine it was a short story. Whatever's happened in the story has made her dislike her daughter. So maybe she's taking much longer to return than she should, and she's taking her mother for granted, leaving her stranded in the car with her wheelchair. And now this is why the mother is asking, had her legs been a small price to pay? In other words, was it worth it? Or actually, if she had her time again, would she rather have prayed to keep her legs and let her daughter die? It's quite powerful stuff. And that's achieved just through the flashback. I was forced into that way of thinking just because I thought, right, how can I return to the beginning again? Now, I hadn't planned that ending when I started. Lots of students think you need to plan everything. It's helpful if you know what your ending is going to be. But another way of looking at it is, if I know my ending is going to return to the beginning, I can just trust that process to happen. You will need to practice this for yourself before the mocks and in the mocks and before the exam. Just give it a go, write this sort of length and see if you can do it, because a circular structure is a really sophisticated technique and it forces you to think about an interesting ending. Many students don't know how to end, and so this is a really quick way to trick your mind into coming up with an ending even when you don't think you can do it. Okay, let's jump into the third technique. This is the extended metaphor, and it's possibly the hardest one to do. So let's hear one and see what I mean. She curled up in the car like a womb, and the rush of traffic in the outside world became a softer humming of noise. Her phone was plugged in, an umbilical cord giving her hope, a link to the outside world. Someone would deliver her soon. The car's belly rocked as the traffic grew heavier, and the rocking made her sleepy. Where was her daughter? What waters kept her away so long? So this is two paragraphs that could have been in that same story that I started before. And I've just set myself the task of picking on a metaphor and extending it. So she curled up in the car like a womb. Now that obviously isn't a metaphor yet, it's a simile. And that's an interesting trick. Extended metaphors often start with a simile. So you start with that simile. What's the car like? Oh, it's like a womb. And obviously I'm thinking about the mother-daughter relationship here as well, so it fits. But now, every time I write something, I'm thinking, well, how can I make it true of being in a car and also being in the womb? So I start with the sound. So I'm thinking, what would a baby hear? Well, sounds that are loud on the outside will be softer inside. So I'll put that in. Then I've got the umbilical cord that connects the baby to its supply of food and love, if you like. So, well, I've got a cable that can go to the phone that's plugged in. And what's it going to be giving the mother? It's not going to be giving the mother food, but it can give her hope of some sort. And there's a link to the outside world. Well, that's the same, isn't it? It's the umbilical cord that's keeping the baby alive. And if the mother gets stuck, let's say she's overheating in the car like babies do or dogs do, she can phone for help. Or it doesn't have to be anything as serious as that. If she gets fed up of waiting for her daughter, she can just ring her up. Or she can ring for a taxi, whatever. But it still works with the womb. Then I've got the idea of her getting out of the car, and instead of somebody rescuing her, I've decided someone is going to deliver her, because that comes from the same semantic field, the same word use that you'd have with pregnancy and the womb. Now I can see the shape of the car. I've kind of got a Volkswagen Golf in my mind here because it's rounded, yeah? So the car's belly rocked as the traffic grew heavier. So I'm imagining her next to a really busy road, and when heavy lorries go by, the car rocks a bit. And obviously I'm thinking about the baby being rocked. And then finally, this image of what waters kept her away so long. This is a symbol of how the mother can't imagine what it is that's keeping her daughter away. How could she leave her so long in the car? And so she's got this metaphor of waters as in a big river to cross or an ocean away. Obviously it's a metaphor, that's not really what's keeping the daughter away. But it fit my description because, as you should know, just before a baby is born, the mother's waters break. Those protective fluids that are in the womb are released, and that paves the way for the baby to come out. So I hope you've seen how you can really enjoy playing with the idea of an extended metaphor. And just as I said with the circular structure, you really need to practice these. It's not long, is it? There's very few words there, but just practice giving them a go. Remember, it starts with a simile, and then you try and find as many ways as you can why the one thing is like the other thing. Right, the final thing I need to teach you are the mistakes which make students really lose marks on this question. So the examiners hate it when you start just chucking in the senses just because your teacher has said senses are a really good idea, put them in. And if you put the senses in with I can see, I can hear, I can smell, those kind of repetitive, obvious, bland statements, it automatically marks your writing out as rubbish, frankly, because real writers never do that. Then when writers get a bit better, they think, I've got to put really brilliant vocabulary in there. But this is a dangerous thing to do, because what often happens is you 80% or 60% know the word and you use it in the wrong context. It doesn't quite work. Or, worse than that, you pick a word that sounds brilliant on its own, but when you stick it in your sentence, it's just totally over the top. So really be cautious about using overambitious vocabulary. Comma splicing is a real pet hate of all teachers. It's where you use a comma instead of a full stop, and it just marks you out as an idiot who doesn't know what they're doing. I'm sorry to put it in such graphic terms, but it's true. If you can't work out where your full stops are going, it's because you're not thinking about what you're writing. And if you make that mistake, it will be almost impossible for you to get a grade 4. It really is a defining feature that separates people who can write from people who can't in the examiner's mind. Another one which does that is the punctuation of dialogue. I teach my students to use very little dialogue because it actually rarely moves a story along. And so I teach them to have only 2 lines of dialogue. But another reason for that is that lots of students get the punctuation of dialogue wrong. And then finally, the use of apostrophes. Apostrophes are actually really easy to get right. And the reason students don't get them right all the time is they don't sit down and actually ruthlessly learn the rules. And there are only 3 rules to getting apostrophes right. You know, it really is as simple as a traffic light. Green means go, orange means get ready, and red means stop. It's actually as simple as that. Well, those 5 things I'm going to teach you in my next video, and when I get really organised, I'll put a link to it up here. So hopefully you can now use a flashback, use a circular structure and an extended metaphor. And if you can't, you're going to go away and practice it now. Post them in the comments below and I will actually make some videos for you if you're feeling brave. Thank you very much for watching and goodbye.